Welcome to the More Than English podcast, where we discuss fascinating and influential ideas, learning English along the way. Here we learn more than English.
I'm your host, Stephen. In this episode and the next one, we're going to focus on the second dimension of Hofstede's cultural dimensions, which is individualism versus collectivism. In the last two episodes, we focused on the first cultural dimension, which was power distance. And if you want to watch those episodes, you can click the link here. So what is this dimension? Well, the fundamental issue here is the degree to which there is interdependence within a society. In other words, do people in a society think in terms of I or we? Another way of saying this is the emphasis on personal freedom or social harmony? So let me give you a few examples, a few things to consider when thinking about if a culture is individualistic or collectivist. Firstly, about families. In individualistic societies, it's more common to have a nuclear family. That's to say that a family mainly consists of parents and their kids. If you're having a dinner or a celebration, maybe you'll be with your parents, kids, and perhaps maybe an uncle and aunt, grandmother or grandfather. But maybe it's not so common to have a family gathering where there's 20, 30, 40 people, right? On the other hand, in collectivist societies, it is common to have a big family that get together and have a big celebration, or just more in terms of daily life. In collectivist societies, it's more common to have a connection with many members of your family, and there to be a strong sense of loyalty or a duty towards your entire family, your entire extended family, not just the nuclear family or your direct family, the ones that you live with or the ones that you see very often. In addition to the family structure, the economy is another aspect which we can look at when determining if a culture is more individualistic or collectivist. In individualistic societies, again, there is usually an emphasis on free market economics. That's to say things like capitalism and entrepreneurialism and the ability to pursue your dreams and so on, the pursuit of happiness as it is common in American philosophy. On the other hand, in collectivist societies, the economic system is far more often communist or socialist, and perhaps there's a less importance placed on the individual pursuit of happiness, right? Because in those societies, happiness is not about I, but we, right? So instead of an economy based on individuals thriving, the idea is that if we make decisions and we do things which are good for the society, good for the group, then it will be good for all the individuals as well. But the focus is not to focus on the individual, but rather focus on the group. And if the group is good, the individuals de facto will be good as well. And one more point before looking at some consequences of individualistic versus collectivist societies. And this last point is about religion. So, still much of the world is religious, but it's becoming less popular decade by decade. But nevertheless, in some societies, or maybe some specific religions, it's more common in these religions or these countries to have a collectivist culture. Although in, let's say, Europe and the US, where Christianity is much more popular, we can see that, for example, Americans don't have a problem with, let's say, believing in God, believing in Jesus, but also wanting to have individual happiness, wanting to thrive, make a lot of money, buy expensive things, and so on. Although, in other Christian communities, maybe more strict Christians, maybe this is less common. But nevertheless, in Christianity, we can say that it's possible to have both things at once, to be individualistic, to thrive for personal success and personal achievements, and at the same time be religious. But nevertheless, in other religions, especially in Buddhism, but also to an extent we can say in Islam and Hinduism, the role of an individual within the group and this idea of social harmony is more pronounced. That's to say that in, for example, countries where Buddhism is more prevalent, it's more common that these countries are also collectivist. And in the next episode, I'm going to give the example of Thailand here, which is a predominantly Buddhist country, and show how, although China has changed over the years and become less collectivist, although still collectivist, Thailand remains to be very collectivist, and perhaps Buddhism is one of the reasons for this. We're going to talk about that in a while, so stay tuned for that. Okay, so in terms of a nation, what are the consequences of it being individualistic or collectivist? Well, the first one is related to direct versus indirect communication. We touched on this in a previous episode, talking about Edward Hall's dimensions, which you can check here. But basically, in a nutshell, whereas Hall talks about low versus high context cultures, I'm not going to go into it now, but you can take a look. Basically, it's touching on this topic of direct versus indirect communication. So, direct communication means, basically, that what you say is what you mean, right? Like, if you have a problem, you say it. If you want to give advice, you just say it directly. If you want to praise somebody, you tell them directly, right? Direct communication. So direct communication is much more common in individualistic societies. Perhaps this is because, in such societies, there is a strong, like we said, a strong emphasis on personal freedom. And this personal freedom includes the freedom to say what you want, right? The freedom of speech. Often this freedom of speech could mean that if you have a problem, you don't have a problem telling somebody about this. Or, for example, if you don't want to do something or you don't like something, you're free to say it. On the other hand, because of, like we said, social harmony, in collectivist societies, it's much more common for indirect communication. This means that if you have a problem, let's say at work, and let's say a boss at work, for example, if they do not like the way an employee maybe is dressed or the way they're doing something, let's just say that they feel like they're dressed a bit inappropriately. Maybe they're expected to wear a suit, but they're just wearing a polo shirt. They probably wouldn't tell them, "What are you doing? You look terrible. You need to dress smarter." This would be too direct, right? Instead, maybe they'll make a comment which is insinuating that there's a problem. This is to keep the social harmony and not to have conflict, right? In fact, when I lived in Japan, there was a funny example of this. It didn't really happen. It probably happened with me, but it went over my head, My haircut was like this back then, and for a teacher in a school, it's maybe not so common, at least for Japanese people, to have such short sides or something like that. And a few times people said to me, "Oh, interesting haircut," and "Oh, thanks." But now looking back, they're probably indirectly communicating to me that maybe it was inappropriate. But, I was a foreigner, a gaijin, as they say. And in Japan, if you're a gaijin, you can get away with some things maybe that the natives can't so much. Another example about Japan is, I was a teacher, right? English teacher. And another English teacher in Japan told me, a woman, American woman, that she went to a party, like a teacher's party, and everybody kept telling her, "Are you not cold? With that dress, are you not cold?" Because apparently she was wearing a relatively short skirt or something like that. But the funny thing was it was in August, and in August it's like 30, 35 degrees every day in Japan. So obviously she was not cold because it was hot every day. So I think this is a good example to show some indirect communication. Basically, they were saying, "I think your dress is a bit too short, it's inappropriate, we wouldn't dress like that here." But instead of saying it so directly, instead they will ask, "Are you not cold?" Another consequence is related to rewards in jobs and so on. So in individualistic societies, it's much more common for, you guessed it, individual rewards, right? This could mean performance-based rewards. You sell the most toys, you sell the most cars, you get a bonus, right? You're the salesperson of the month, or you've done the most good work during a month, you're the employee of the month, right? Usually in these societies, the focus is on the individual, at least traditionally. It's always changing. But when we think individualism, we think individual rewards and competition, right? In a company, you have a team, but the team is even competing against each other. Who can sell the most stuff? And this is very common in Western societies, in businesses, especially from the 1960s onwards. On the other hand, in collectivist societies, instead of individual rewards, you guessed it, there's much more emphasis on group rewards and also rewards based on loyalty. Remember, loyalty is something very important for collectivist societies, and this has many consequences. One of them is that instead of getting a reward for selling the most products, you might get a reward for being in the company for 10 years or 20 years, 30 years, right? So instead of your performance, it's more about being loyal, right? We said also in the family, loyalty is probably more important in collectivist societies, not just loyalty towards your parents and your siblings, but loyalty towards your entire extended family. If they need help, you should help them, right? Whereas in individualistic societies, if your cousin calls you asking for some money, maybe you'll help them the first time, but the third time, maybe you say, hey, bro, you're on your own. Like, I can't keep lending you some money. Another consequence is related to innovation versus stability. And this is a common criticism of China. Although China in the last 40, 50 years has grown immensely and has been a great success story economically and for many reasons, one of the critiques that some people say about China is that they lack innovation. And perhaps one of the reasons why they lack innovation is because they focus more on stability, right? And maybe these two words are not exactly antonyms, but it's hard to have stability and innovation at the same time, right? Unless you're constantly innovating, but that's kind of impossible. Even in the US and other innovative countries, there's peaks and troughs. There's some periods of time where there innovations going all over in some particular area, like we could talk about Silicon Valley. But then there's troughs. There's good times and bad times. It's hard to have stability and innovation constantly at the same time. So while China is criticized sometimes for lack of innovation, which could be a consequence of their collectivist culture or traditional collectivist culture, the upside of this is that over the last 40, 50 years, there's been quite remarkably stable growth. Even though, for a couple of decades, they were growing by 6, 10, 12% per year. It was stable, which is incredible. So yeah, stability versus innovation. The point I'm trying to make here is that individualism or collectivism, not one of them is better than the other. They're just different. They're perhaps suited to different things. They have their own pros and cons, right? And to finish this episode, which is the first part talking about individualism versus collectivism, let me talk to you about two expressions which traditionally are related to individualistic societies, but have very different consequences. The first one is the rat race. The rat race refers to a competitive, repetitive, and often exhausting work routine in which people work long hours in order to achieve some kind of individual success or improve their status. I mentioned individual success here because usually this is related to that rather than, working hard to support your family or to improve your national economy or something like that, right? And the idea of rat race, why it's called the rat race, is you can imagine a rat running on a wheel. The rat probably doesn't have any real motivation or goals related to this. They're not trying to break their personal best, they're not trying to run faster than they've run before. Probably not. We can't ask them, right? But probably not. They're probably not going to trying to improve their cardiovascular fitness, but rather they're just doing it because instinctively it feels like running. But the point here is that even though in many countries they work very long hours, or let's say in Africa, if you're a farmer in some rural part of Africa and you have to work long hours, right? And it's like I said, repetitive and exhausting, right? But the difference is we wouldn't say they're in the rat race because they're not working for some boss and trying to work their way up the corporate ladder, but rather they're farming because, if we're giving the example of farmers, right? They're farming because, well, of course, they need to make a living, but also they're doing it to try to support their family. Maybe it's a family business, right? So the sons and daughters and, other parts of the family are involved. So instead of being just an individual task, I work for this company, my family are separate, it's more of a communal task. We are a family of farmers. We work hard, but it's to ensure that our family has money, our families can thrive and so on. So that's one of the differences, right? Just working hard doesn't mean you're in the rat race. The point is, if you're working repetitive, exhausting hours for some corporation that, is not related to you really in any way other than you just work for them, and the fact that you work long hours because you have in your head this idea that if you just keep working, you're going to achieve some kind of individual success or improve status or something like that. So I would say traditionalist is an American expression and perhaps an individualistic expression. But we can see now in China, China's employees have been hard working for a long time, but especially nowadays, now that China is much more urbanized and developed and less agricultural, people working more in, tertiary economies instead of primary economies like agriculture, we can see this rat race as well kind of spreading around the world. And the idea of 996, the 996 rule, which is popular in China, kind of exemplifies this. If you're unaware, the 996 rule in China is the idea that employees should work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. That's 72 hours a week. Okay. Personally, for me, I couldn't do it. But I respect and I admire people who have this work ethic, and perhaps they want to work so many hours so they can make a lot of money and save money and so on. But I don't think this is a collectivist value, even though it's maybe getting quite popular in China. Instead, I think this is an individualistic value, which, having spread, let's say, to China, is making China more individualistic. We'll talk about this soon. And the last one is work-life balance. The rat race and work-life balance are very, very different things, right? On the one hand, like we said, rat race is more about working hard, long hours, repetitive, exhausting, in order to achieve some kind of individual success. Whereas on the other hand, work-life balance is almost the opposite. Work-life balance is the idea that we shouldn't work too much because we should spend some time doing things which are not work-related for our mental health and things like that. For example, to spend time doing hobbies, spend time with friends, spend time with family. And, family, so, maybe we could say this is a bit collectivist, but usually work-life balance is associated with individualism, especially in the 21st century, because we hear about it a lot in Europe, places like Germany and Sweden and so on. And in these countries, the idea is more individualistic, I would say. So work-life balance is not the idea that you should only work 4 days a week, only work 30 hours a week, for example, because you need to spend time with your family specifically, but rather you should, this idea that, I only want to work 4 days, so I have 3 days to do whatever I want, right? This could be spending time with family, but it could also be just spending time alone, could be reading books, doing some hobbies, right? So these two concepts, the rat race and work-life balance, I would argue are both individualistic ideas, but they have very different consequences, right? So what do you think about that? Would you agree that these two concepts are individualistic? Would you say that you are more of an individualistic person? Or do you think the world nowadays maybe is too individualistic and we should get back to our roots, get back to our families, our social circles? I'd love to know what you think. Let me know. So that's it for part 1 of individualism versus collectivism. And in part 2, we're going to look at 4 countries, basically focusing on 2. And, well, I'll leave that as a surprise. So, see you then.
Finally, here's today's key vocabulary. Page 1. Interdependence. The act of depending on each other. Nuclear family. A family consisting of 2 parents and their children. free market economy, based on supply and demand instead of government control. Entrepreneurialism, the ability and act of starting new private businesses. To thrive, to grow, develop, or be successful. De facto, existing in fact, although not necessarily intended. To insinuate, to suggest, without being direct, that something unpleasant is true. To go over someone's head. Too difficult or strange for someone to understand. Page 2. To get away with something. To avoid being punished. Antonym. 2 words with opposite meanings. Peaks and troughs. Good times and bad times. Corporate ladder. The hierarchy of increasingly high status jobs within a company. And finally, tertiary economy. Businesses that provide services but do not make anything. Thanks guys, see you next time.